housed in the community, and people fed them. It was called in Yiddish tag days. Every person was responsible for one day for one yeshiva boy, and they fed them whatever they themselves ate. So to a certain extent, it was the luck of the draw. If you chose wrong, you could have potatoes 6 days in a row, or not even potatoes 6 days in a row. But that system was a very popular system in Eastern Europe, literally till after the First World War. Not to have, they had neither central dormitories, nor did they have central kitchens. Yeshiva only taught, and how one survived at the yeshiva was one's own concern to a great extent, though the yeshiva did provide this system of tag. The chafetz chaim in 1869 began in his small town in Radin, this yeshiva, which later grew into the famous yeshiva of Radin. And he taught the boys. He sat and learned with them. However, the yeshiva really did not take off until 1883, when the chafetz chaim's daughter married Rabbi Hirsch Levinson. Rabbi Levinson was one of the outstanding students of Volozhin. He was a giant of a man in size, and the chafetz chaim was under 5 feet tall, and he was 6'4", 6'5", his son-in-law, and the picture of them together was always bordered on being humorous, and they were opposites in personality also, because Hirsch had no concern with the outside world whatsoever. He didn't care how he looked. One sleeve was always inside out, and tie was never knotted. But he was a great genius, a tremendous genius in learning, and a great tzaddik. And I have heard from people who knew them together that the chafetz chaim many times would, I wouldn't say criticize, but he would comment to Reb Hirsch about certain things, and Reb Hirsch always bent down and listened to him and smiled and listened to him, but he never changed his behavior. He never redid his personality because of it. But when Reb Hirsch came in 1883, that's really the beginning of Radin as a yeshiva, because he's the one who built it and expanded it. As he was also a very unlikely success as a great fundraiser, which is an essential part of being a successful head of the yeshiva, and has traditionally always been part of it. And he enlisted the chafetz chaim on his fundraising trip, and together the two of them raised substantial money for the yeshiva, expanded the yeshiva. In 1902, they built the first building for the yeshiva, and in 1913, they built the major building for the yeshiva. That building survived even World War I, and remained the building of the yeshiva until the Nazis destroyed it in the occupation of Poland and Lithuania in 1940. But to get back to our story, in 1870, the chafetz chaim, working on his sefer, went into isolation for a period of time. His son records that the chafetz chaim once told him that the great work of the Rambam could only be accomplished because the Rambam hid in a cave for 10 years from the Almohad, who attempted to forcibly convert the Jews, and the Rambam and his family lived in caves in the Atlas Mountains for a decade. So he said that's the only way to really write the great sefer, is to divorce oneself from the problems of life and the problems of the community. There probably was a hint of irony in what he said, but the truth of the matter is that it's very hard to write anything decent if one does not have long periods of uninterrupted concentration. People say, well, you have an hour off in the afternoon, why don't you write? Because you can't write that way. I mean, there are people who perhaps can, but most people cannot. And it takes, you have to get oneself in the mood, and it's the cumulative effect, and it's concentration, it's not being interrupted by the phone or visitors, it's just being alone. And the chafetz chaim was able to accomplish that in 1870, in less But it's interesting, in this small town, he made a small yeshiva there as well to study with the boys. And he returned to Radin in 1871. Now, until 1871, you remember the chafetz chaim, as I had mentioned, was born in 1853. So he was, I'm sorry, I told you that was a mistake. 1840. So until 1871, the chafetz chaim was not a public figure. And in fact, his son records that his first public drosha was in 1871. In other words, until he was 30, he never got up to speak publicly. And his first public drosha, which took place in it wasn't in Giant Stadium, it was in the small base medrash in Radin. Radin was perhaps 100 families. And he spoke about Lashon Hara. That was the topic of his speech. And the chafetz chaim himself remarked later that there's not much that he can say about Lashon Hara without violating the principle. So he said that any lecture or speech regarding slander, regarding Lashon Hara, requires much more preparation than anything else because of the fact that you cannot in the same speech violate the principle that you are attempting to promulgate. He traveled, as I mentioned to you, he published the Sefer Chafetz Chaim anonymously, without his name. And he traveled from town to town selling subscriptions to the Sefer. The subscription price was 50 kopecks if it was unbound, and it was much more if it was bound. In his travels to sell subscriptions, the subscribers, you'll notice in the old literature forum, and not only in literature, but in the other forum, you'll notice there's always a list of subscribers. These are people who advanced you money before the Sefer ever went to press, because how could you afford to print it otherwise? The chafetz chaim needed 1,000 rubles to print his Sefer. He never in his life had 1,000 rubles, and one fell time at his money. So therefore, what you did is you went from town to town, and you collected this money from the subscribers, and you promised them, in effect, that when the Sefer was published, you would get them the copy of the Sefer. As the chafetz chaim went from town to town, in many of the instances, he never advertised himself as being the author. He just said that he's the salesman for this Sefer, and that this is going to be a very good Sefer, which will have practical value for everyone involved, because everyone needs the extra dimension of care regarding Lashon Hara. And because of this, therefore, he recommended it. But he avoided all statements regarding the author. In many communities, the rabbi himself was sensitive enough to ferret out the fact that this was not, a little Jew just selling books. And he could figure out that the chafetz chaim was the author. But in many other communities, no one knew who he was. And he would speak between Mincha and Ma'ariv in the base medrash, in the little shul of the town where he was visiting, about objects and lessons in Judaism. He always spoke in a very simple vein. He never spoke a pimple. He never said great Torah. He never tried to reconcile different opinions in halacha to explain a difficult passage in the Rambam. That wasn't the chafetz chaim. The chafetz chaim spoke that one should be careful to shave off the horns of one's cow so that the cow doesn't damage people. How do you like that for a speech from the great man of the generation? We would say, if the chafetz chaim would be here today, he would say, drive carefully. Wear your seatbelts, exactly. And that was, to him, that was fair. And it is fair. But we're accustomed that unless the person starts out with a difficult passage in the Rambam and asks 14 questions upon it and makes it so complicated that no one can understand it, so then he's not a great man in Torah, right? But if he tells you to shave off the horns of your cow, anybody can do that. And therefore, the simplicity of the chafetz chaim was his best disguise. Because people went home and they said, his wife said, who spoke in shul today? He said, I don't know, there was a Jew there. And he told us, and I'm going to go ahead and do it now, bring out Bessie and we'll cut off the horns. He said, to me, you're not Torah, right? They have a mazik in your house. They have something that can damage. In Radin, there was the chafetz chaim's cow was well known. They used to call it the chafetz chaim's cow, because the chafetz chaim's cow had her horns cut, and it was fenced in, and it never went anywhere. And the Goyish peasants, the non-Jewish peasants, who saw in the chafetz chaim a saint, that's one of the, it's just, one of the unbelievable things in life is that they saw in the chafetz chaim a saint, but they can run a pogrom tomorrow in the same way. And that was not, there was no contradiction in that. But they would attempt to attract and bring the chafetz chaim that he should walk on their field. Because if he walked on their fields, so they felt the holy man would bring a blessing. When they couldn't entice the chafetz chaim, they would try and entice the chafetz chaim's cow. Now, that's not as humorous as it sounds, because, not only non-Jews could think of such an idea. But the chafetz chaim took it all seriously. The chafetz chaim once wrote a letter back home when he was in Warsaw, working on the printing of Mishnah Berurah. So he wrote a letter home, and in the letter home, it's reprinted here by his son. The main topic of the letter was to make sure that the cow is locked and that you don't let it walk around the town, that it should damage people, should step on things that are not his. But a chafetz chaim, his cow, that was important, as it is important. The great people are always seen in the small, little nuances and vignettes of life. In 1878, the first 4,000 copies of the chafetz chaim Sefer, the chafetz chaim, was finally issued, was printed in Berurah, and now the chafetz chaim retraced his route to distribute the book to the subscribers. Because the United Parcel Service didn't operate in Radin. That wasn't their hub. And so he went and he saw everybody again. Now, I want to tell you what the chafetz chaim was, and I have it here. It's too bad that those of you who are fortunate enough to see this on tape, I don't have a video, but if you'll send me in a self-addressed postage paid envelope, I'll send you a copy of what I'm showing the people here. This is the first edition of the Mishnah Berurah, of the chafetz chaim's Mishnah Berurah. The chafetz chaim, before he sold it, went through every page to make sure that the page was there and that it was not folded or bent. And then he wrote in the corner in his own handwriting, Yugo, Memvov Gimel Harry, meaning that it's been looked over. And only then would he sell it. And this is the first edition of the Mishnah Berurah with his own handwriting. And anyone who knows his handwriting recognizes it. And that's how he sold the book. Try that with Farrar, Straus and Company. So he retraced his steps to resell to give everybody the book. Now, chafetz chaim had a policy that he did not sell his books to wealthy people. He said wealthy people have a library, they put the book in a library, they never read it. They just want to have the book. And he doesn't want the book to people who are not going to read it. And then they'll say later when he became world famous and wealthy people came to him and some of them wanted autographed copies, imagine. He wouldn't sell them the book. He would not say, he said, it's not for you. It's not going to benefit you. Originally, he told his son that there only were 4,000 copies, so why should he waste it? Later, when the copies were in the tens of thousands, and eventually in the hundreds of thousands, but he still would not sell the book to people who he felt would not read it. His son tells the story that a man once came, two interesting stories. A wealthy man once came, and he told him, Rebbe, I want to buy the book. How much is it? He said, 1 ruble. So he put his hand in his pocket, the wealthy man, and he took out a bill, and he crunched up the bill, and he put it in the chafetz chaim's hand. He shook hands, he took the book, and he left. Chafetz chaim thought that he gave him a 1 ruble note. Later, he looked at it, and he saw it was a 100 ruble note. So the chafetz chaim hired a wagon, he pursued the man, and he couldn't catch him. But he found out who the person was. And 2 to 3 years later, the rich man opened the door, and the chafetz chaim is at the door, and he says, here's your 99 rubles change. The book costs $1. I had the same experience, just to show you. I had the same experience in Eretz Yisrael. There's a great machaber of Florida who wouldn't want me to say his name, so I'm not going to say it. But he lives on the whole Vilkamir 4 in Bnei Brak, in a palace that if you blink an eye, you passed it, you missed it. And he likes Florida on Shav. And the reputation is if you have a piece of the mind, if you don't understand, get a hold of his faith. The man has a clarity that, that's unusual. And he's like a hidden, nobody knows about him, right? He's just doing God's work. So I went to visit him, but the last time I was in Eretz Yisrael, I hope to see him this time again in Eretz Yisrael. But I went to see him last time in Eretz Yisrael. He opened the doors also, about 4'8", with the sheyidl, and he welcomes you in to the kitchen, salon, bedroom, dining room. And he's giving you a cup of tea, and I tell him, Rebbe, I want to buy your sforim. He said, what do you need my sforim for? So I was warned in advance, he doesn't sell his sforim. What do you need it for? Put it in my library. I tell him that I teach Gemara, which is almost true. And I told him I teach Gemara, and, sometimes I heard that your sforim could help me teach, and if you can help somebody. So he thought about it, he said, that's right. He said, if you teach Gemara, he said, I'll tell you my sforim. So he had 4 volumes. He exists about 20, but he had 4 of them. In fact, the sforim are the furniture, they're the paintings in the house, the curtains, the carpet, everything else that we have to decorate the house. His house is basic black. He has the sforim. He gives me the 4 volumes, and I say, how much is it? He says they're 6 shekel each. So I give him 50 shekels. So he says, would you mind waiting a moment? And he puts on his coat, and he goes away. I know where he's going. He comes back in 5 minutes. He said, the makola didn't have change, he said. The grocery store didn't have change. He said, I have to walk to the next street. I'm sorry for keeping you so late, but I have to walk into the next street to the hardware store, and here's the 26 shekel back. So I said to him, Rebbe, I don't want the 26 shekel. I said, I'm sure there are poor Jews in Bnei Brak. You know the stuff that they're better. Keep the 26 shekel. What do you don't have to give me? He says to me, if you want to give charity, you give charity. He said, I'm not your shliach. I'm not your messenger. He said, if you want to give, he said, the safer is 6 shekel. You bought 4. He said, you can multiply, can't you? He said, 6 times 4 is 24, right? So here's 26 shekel back. Well, there are Jews like that in the world. But the chafetz chaim made an art form out of it. Couldn't give him anything. The Baron Rothschild heard of him. So the Baron Rothschild said that he wants all of his books. So the chafetz chaim debated. All of this is in the book by his son, which really has the ring of authenticity. So the chafetz chaim debated whether he should send the books to the Baron Rothschild. Because he said the Baron Rothschild, he ain't going to read it. Right? He's not going to give up his businesses and everything, and he finishes reading my book. He wants to do the table, and he wants to have, he's got a big library, he's got a book for me. But he said, on the other hand, he said, the Baron won't understand. If I refuse to sell him the book, He won't understand that. He'll take it as an insult. And he said, the Baron has done such good things to the Jewish people, how can I insult him? So therefore, the chafetz himself made the package. They made a special package. They got special wrapping paper, and they wrapped all the books together. And they got somebody to go to Warsaw to mail it to the Baron in France. And the Baron sent back 100 francs or 100 marks. I mean, sent back a tremendous amount of money. So the chafetz wrote him back, and he said, you made a mistake. You know, it doesn't cost that kind of money. And I'm sending you back the change that you're entitled to. So the Baron wrote him back, and he said that his policy is never to accept change, he said. His policy was, he said, he never accepts change, but that the chafetz if he wants to, should use the money for the yeshiva. So for the yeshiva, the chafetz kept it. And we'll see later, the story was that the city of Eishishok, which was near Radin, and which had a large kollel of Prussian, of people who learned Torah, the city burned down because in the Lithuanian villages, which were thatched roofs and wood structures, it was not hard to engender a conflagration on a regular basis. So the entire village burned down. So the chafetz then wrote to the Baron, to Rothschild, and Rothschild rebuilt the entire village. He rebuilt everybody's home, he rebuilt the kollel, and he paid everybody, then he rebuilt the whole thing. No, I know, the Rothschild, well, you know, it cost 5,000 marks or whatever, you know, it wasn't money. But the chafetz then felt justified in having sent him the book. He said, from heaven, they did, you know, I was encouraged by heaven to do the right thing. As I wouldn't have sent them the books, so I never could have asked them, right? The poor people in Eishishok would never have been rebuilt. So the chafetz saw it as a heavenly signal, so to speak, that he was supposed to send the books to the Baron. Now, in the city of Radin, as in all small Jewish cities, I have mentioned here the chafetz occupied no official position. So there was a rabbi, and there was a dayan, and there was a sheikh. The chafetz was a balabos. He was a layman. He never occupied any official position. And because of that, there were many, many times that there were disputes in town. And bad things happen in town. It happens among Jews. And everybody took the chafetz for granted. And there were times that in town, the rabbi could not enforce the matter. There's the story that's told that there was a man in town who was like the wealthiest man in town, but he was also the town bully. And everybody was afraid of him. And one day, somebody disagreed with him or something, and he hit that person. So the rabbi, the matter was brought to the rabbi, and the rabbi said that we should announce from the pulpit that unless he apologizes publicly, we're going to put him in chayrim. On a small town, if you were a chayrim, that was the end. Because in a small, they wouldn't marry you, they wouldn't bury you. You couldn't get an aliyah, they didn't count you for the minyan, you were a non-person. And therefore that was like the ultimate weapon. But the man was so powerful that the rabbi was afraid to say it. So the rabbi told the shamus that the shamus should announce it. The shamus was also afraid. So the shamus didn't announce it. The chafetz who knew the story, got up on the bina himself, and he said, it says in the Torah, that you're not allowed to be afraid of a person when right is involved, and therefore I announce, he said, I, Yisrael Meir Hakein from Radin, announce that if so-and-so does not come today for mincha and apologize publicly for hitting the person, we will put him in chaim. The man came and apologized. So you had, this is again the gentlest, kindest, most sensitive human being, but the matters that went to the rectitude of the community, the chafetz was uncompromising, and he was hard as iron. He was the Isha Barzel. I hope that we'll see it regarding some of his public statements regarding other great world events that happened. In 1886, he wrote an accompanying volume to the chafetz called Shmirat HaLashon. And those two are usually sold together, bound together. They are the compendium of laws regarding speech. The chafetz is more on Lashon Hara, and Shmirat HaLashon is other halachas regarding speech. In 1887, he published again a small book called Sfas Tomim. Sfas Tomim was a book that emphasized how to speak. It was like the workbook, or the manual that went with the other two. Because the other two told you what not to say. So then you ended up not being able to speak, right? The chafetz said that's not what the Torah intended. The Torah did not intend us to be mute. It did not intend that we should not be able to speak. So he wrote a companion book, How to Speak Nicely. There's an excellent little book that was put out here. He's one of the teachers in our yeshiva, and he's a great person. His name is Rabbi David Bernstein. And he wrote a book. It's a book for children, but believe me, I read the book. Big children, till 95, you can read the book. You'll have benefit from it. And certainly for children. It's called Apples of Gold. And it's a 110-page illustrated little book with examples of how to speak. And it's based on this sefer of the chafetz. It's a marvelous little book that everybody should have in the house, and you should read it. And it will help you in many respects. In 1880, he began to work on the mission of Berurah. Now, the mission of Berurah is the magnum opus, the great work of the chafetz. Because what the chafetz did here in the mission of Berurah is that he took the Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, the first section of Shulchan Aruch, which deals with the laws of prayer, of Tzitzis, of Tefillah, of Shabbos, of Yom Tov, of Pesach, of Eruvin, and he took and he made a commentary to it, and he decided all of the matters that required decision. It is a work of, it remains today the basic work on the matter, 100 years later. And this book, The Mission of Berurah, came out in stages. We have it now in 6 volumes, but it came out in 11 or 12 different stages. And it took 28 years to complete the writing of the book, from 1880 to 1908. And the book was not written by the chafetz alone. His co-authors on it were his 2 sons-in-law, Rav Hirsch Levinson and Rav Aaron Cohen, and his son, Rav Aryeh Leib Tutka. And it's interesting that in the son's memoirs, he says, that's why you will find in a number of areas in the mission of Berurah that the mission of Berurah contradicts itself. Because he said the chafetz decided one way, and his son-in-law, 300 pages later, decided the other way. And he says that's the reconciliation, is that it was written by different people. Now, there are many that never saw what his son wrote, and therefore, as you can imagine, there are great pilpulim to reconcile the contradiction. To a certain extent, like putting an elephant through the eye of a needle. But the son says very clearly that and he gives 4 or 5 instances. So when it was pointed out to the chafetz that he said maybe in the next edition you should change it, So he said, no. He said, it's in heaven. He says, this is all from heaven. He said, if in heaven they weren't printed this way and we didn't catch it, so it must be that the other opinion is also just as valid. And therefore he never changes it. It remains that way today. You know, there are people who are always trying to improve. But this is a sefer that has resisted a great deal of improvement. Though I would tell you that there are pieces of it that have been edited, pieces of the Mishnah Berurah that have been edited and changed in order to conform to something. In 1884, the book, the Mishnah Berurah, was published, and here on the cover page, his name appears. Yisrael Meir, the son of Ayazev HaKohen, from the city of Radin. So they asked him, how come here he published with his name, and in the chafetz chaim he published anonymously? He said, because this is a book of halacha. It's a book of halacha, and therefore, he said, if people disagree with me, I want them to write to me and tell me where I'm wrong, so that I would be able to make corrections. And the truth of the matter is that Rabbanim did write to him, and the second edition was different than the first edition. He did make certain corrections in it. Now, the chafetz chaim in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s published an enormous amount of books, small books, again for Jewish people who found themselves in problems. One of his most famous works is the book Ahavas Chesed, which is a small monograph on how a Jew is supposed to do charity, love others, bring people into their homes, etc., all the mitzvahs of Chesed. So it's a shulchan aruch on how to do chesed. Again, it's a remarkable piece of work. Been republished many times. He wrote a book for Jewish soldiers who were conscripted in the Tsar's army. In the 1850s, 60s, 70s, large numbers of Jewish soldiers were conscripted in the Tsar's army, not just the small children that were taken away in the decree of the Kantonistim, but adults also, and every town had to supply a quota. Most of the time, those soldiers drifted away from Judaism. It was impossible, or they felt it was impossible to observe any of the Jewish traditions while being a soldier in the Tsar's army. And therefore, it became accepted that if you went to the army, like you were freed from your obligation of being a Jew. The chafetz chaim wrote a sefer called Machane Yisrael, the Camp of Israel, which was a book that was written specially for these soldiers. The chafetz chaim wrote there how to be a minimum shomer Shabbos, how to be a minimum of eating kosher, how not to shave with a razor, how to shave with other things, how to do things on Shabbos that you're not over on Isurim Doraisa. Also a remarkable sefer. And the chafetz chaim himself distributed the book to the Jewish soldiers. He also organized in towns, wherever he could, that there would be a kosher kitchen for Jewish soldiers among the Jews, and that they should supply them with food. He also raised funds to send to Jewish soldiers so that they would have money and they wouldn't have to eat, and the commissary of the Tsar would be able to buy kosher food. And it's also interesting that he refused to publicize this book amongst the civilian Jews, because he said the book has too many kulas in it. It has too many heterim in it. And there's a difference, he says, when you're in the Tsar's army, what is permitted for you to eat, and when you're sitting in your home and you're not under any duress. And therefore, this book, Machane Yisrael, was exclusively for soldiers. In the First World War, again, it had a great deal of distribution. The second book that he wrote was for Jews who went to America. Again, you have to have a picture of the personality. The chafetz chaim felt, as did other rabbis of the time, Eastern European rabbis, that going to America was spiritual death. That it couldn't be. And when people came and asked for a bracha, people before they left for America came to the chafetz chaim and asked for a bracha, a blessing that they should be matzliach. He refused to see them. And he refused to give them such a blessing. And when people came to him for advice, he said, what do you have to go to America for? He said, you can stay here. Now, here is one of the most interesting conversations between the father and the son regarding America. The son disagreed with the father's policy. The son said to his father, he said, you will not be able to stop the flow of emigration to the United States. You have to realize, he said, that putting an issur, by putting a ban and saying not to go, that accomplishes nothing. They're going to go. So the father said, so what shall I do? So the son said, this is on page 55, and I'm going to have to identify it so you know that I'm not making it up. The son said, well, you should go with them. You should go to America. If you go to America, you'll have an influence. You'll keep them as Jews. So the chafetz chaim thought about it. And the chafetz chaim said, you're right. I should go to America. He said, I have a proof. So I have a proof from the Tanakh. Because in Malachim, it's written that the Novi Yirmiyahu, after the Churban of the Bayis Rishon, so there were Jews that wanted to go to Egypt. The Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael was destroyed. After Gedalia was assassinated, that's on the previous page. The Jews didn't know what to do, so there was as many as 10% of the Jewish population in Eretz Yisrael wanted to go to Egypt. The Novi said, no, don't go. You're not allowed to go to Egypt. It's no place, Egypt. It's not good for you, Egypt. The Novi said no. They went anyway. Then the Novi went to Egypt. Yirmiyahu himself violated his own advice. Because once he saw that they went, then his responsibility was to go and to build a Jewish community and to save them. So the chafetz chaim said, you're right, it is my responsibility. I should go to America. But he said, I'm already old and feeble, it's a difficult trip, I can't leave what I have here. He said, but this much I'll do, I'll write a book that'll help them be Jews in America. And that's the Sefer Nidchei Yisrael. Jews who are pushed away, because for them America was the end. The chafetz chaim was overjoyed. About 10 years later, an American rabbi, doesn't say who, a rabbi from America, visited the chafetz chaim and told him that in America things were getting better, that there was some sort of Jewish life, and not everybody was a Machal of Shabbos, and that somehow in America Judaism would also make it. We're not talking about our time, we're talking about the 1890s probably. So the chafetz chaim said the only problem is, he said, like you have a boiling pot and you pour cold water in it. He said the first drops of cold water are burned. It takes a while for the pot to cool off. He said in the first 20 years, everybody that went was lost. He said, you're right, eventually America will be something. But those that went early, he said, they are lost. But he wrote this book, Nidchei Yisrael. In 1907, the chafetz chaim suffered a tremendous tragedy in his own family when his 18-year-old son passed away. This 18-year-old son was a tremendous Ilu. And the chafetz chaim had great and high hopes for him. He developed a type of viral pneumonia, and he passed away. And the chafetz chaim mourned him his entire life. In fact, some of his latest poems were written in memory of the son whom he lost. And the chafetz chaim was not free of tragedy because at that time his wife died as well. and the chafetz chaim felt that he was going to leave Radin, that it was not a fortunate place for him, and that the troubles, the tragedies had piled up. But his son and his daughters convinced him to remarry so that he would be able to stay in Radin. He married a woman who was much younger than he, who brought with her children, one daughter at least, and they were remarried, and the chafetz chaim lived with her for almost 30 years. And she is the one that enabled him to remain there and was his faithful companion throughout his life. From 1892 onward, the chafetz chaim made his first wife close their store. You remember I mentioned to you that they lived off the proceeds of this small general goods store that she had. Chafetz chaim made her close the store because he said the store had too many problems, and he didn't have time to keep the books any longer. Remember, he was the bookkeeper. And therefore, they lived off the sale of his books. Off of the sale of his books, that was his income. His son writes that in many of the works that his father wrote, and I think it's important for us to understand this because of the fact that we always, in nostalgia, have a different picture of what the reality was. So we would think in our time nobody would have the nerve to disagree with the chafetz chaim, or to publicly disagree with him, or to accuse the chafetz chaim of being too liberal. The tzaddik, the holy rabbi, chafetz chaim had the good fortune that he outlived all of his contemporaries, which always helps, because to the next generation, you're the 90-year-old rabbi, most of the 35 and 4-year-old rabbis aren't going to start up with you. I once heard it from a Berurah Kamenetsky, Berurah, that he told me that there was a question there of a certain Rosh Yeshiva, or he, performing the wedding. And they gave it to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, the Rosh Yeshiva, waived his prerogative, so to speak. So Rabbi Yaakov told me that it's not because he felt that he is greater than him, but it's because he felt that he was older, he said. In Chochma ein kan zikna yesh kan, he said. There's not wisdom, there's at least age. Meaning that there's a deference in halacha, a deference in society, for someone who was in the chafetz chaim. When we talk about the chafetz chaim, we're talking about him in the 1930s, when there was nobody as old as he was. He died when he was 95 almost. So there was no one to dispute. But when he was in his 50s, and when he was writing these books, there was lots of disputation. They disagreed. The chafetz chaim wrote, for instance, that one was allowed to shave with a machine, like an electric shaver, we would call it. One was allowed to use depilatory powders to remove hair. And there was strong objection to that, especially from certain Hasidic circles, where not having a beard was tantamount to having lost the way completely. The chafetz chaim said that we have to deal with the practicalities. He said not everybody's going to wear a beard in our time, and therefore we have to tell them what is the permissible way not to have a beard. And to say that everybody has to have one is not realistic. But he was roundly criticized for it. The chafetz chaim published a book called Likutei Halachos, which is on Seder courtship, on the book, and especially it's a parish from Masechet Zvachim, to one of the Masechtas in Shas. What the chafetz chaim did was he made it in the format of the Gemara, as Berurah Gemara. Well, at this time there was a tremendous machlokas that had occurred against the Radin Rebbe, the Gershon Henoch Leiner, who wrote also a sefer called Sidrei Taharos, which was a series of books on the Mishnah of Taharos, of Seder Taharos. There's no Gemara on Taharos, with the exception of Nida. So he gathered all the Gemaras that exist throughout Shas, and we published it in the form of a Gemara, as never a Gemara. And don't ask what a dispute there was, and what troubles he had from it. Even in general, a person that underwent a lot of controversy. But it was just too much. So the chafetz chaim did the same with Maseches Zvachim, and he also had a tremendous amount of controversy. So the chafetz chaim said that throughout the ages there have always been those that have put out these types of books. He said the Rishonim did, the Baal Halachas Gedolos did, the Rif did, the Rosh, and he said all of these things. And he said, since we are close to the Geula, somebody has to make Seder Kochim popular and understandable, because Kochim has to do with the laws of the temple, and the korbanos and the sacrifices, etc. The Kohanim have to know what to do. This is the way to do it. But it was not without controversy. It was not without criticism. He also, you see, the man prolific amount of swearing. Now again, he was helped by his son-in-law, his sons-in-law, and his son on all of these swearing. But basically, they were his swearing. It was his idea, and he put it together, and he was responsible for it. The Teras Kohanim, which is the halachic medrash for the Chumash of Vayikra, he put out a corrected edition, and he put it out with the commentary of the Gaon of Vilna and his own commentary to explain what the Gaon meant. And these are all standard works of scholarship today. They are the basic works of scholarship on these subjects. They've been retrieved many, many times. It's interesting that his son, I just want to mention this also, his son says that you will hear tremendous legends about my father and his belief in Mashiach. He says, don't believe any of them. He said, I never heard it. We never saw it. He said, my father's faith was never recognizable in his behavior. He behaved like a simple, ordinary Jew. And he said his faith in the Mashiach was unbounded, but you didn't see it from him. He quotes his father as saying many times that this generation, especially beginning in the 1870s when the Chovevei Tzion began Jewish colonization in Palestine, and later on when the Zionist movement began, and even later when the Balfour Declaration came out in 1917, the chafetz chaim's opinion regarding all of them was that this is ikvus of the Mashiach. These are the footsteps of the Messiah, but he said the secular Jews can ruin it yet. God is doing, but the secular Jews can ruin it. And he said, and they don't understand the basic lesson regarding Eretz Yisrael. He said, we were thrown out of it twice already because Jews didn't understand the basic lesson that in Eretz Yisrael you have to behave yourself. That's the king's palace, and there you have to behave yourself. And you don't behave yourself, it's not yours. Then you're a goner. Then you're sent away. So he repeated this statement. And his son again says that his father was not anti. He said there were those that were so anti that their anti-Zionism spilled over into becoming anti-Eretz Yisrael. He said that was not the chafetz chaim at all. And that the chafetz chaim himself wanted and left a number of times to go to Eretz Yisrael. And every time, because of various reasons, he didn't make it. and he said that from heaven they stopped me. His son, Rabbi Yolei Pupko, went there to Israel. He went on a trip to visit. And he came back and never told his father that he was going. When he came back and he saw his father and he told him, so his father said two things. He said, it's a good thing you didn't tell me beforehand that you were going. But he said, I don't understand, if you were there, why did you come back? Who gave you permission to come back? And those words were prophetic. And in general, we see that the Chafetz Chaim spoke out very strongly against secularism amongst Jews, and against the Kofrim, and against the new types of schools that they created, and against the new type of education, against the new type of Jew that they wanted to create. And he also spoke out very strongly against the communists. As we'll see in the next lecture, which is going to be the concluding lecture, which is from 1914 to his death, the Chafetz Chaim was a bitter foe of the communists and of the Jewish communists, to the extent that he said that it was even permissible to go out with violent force to prevent their success, because he said they would destroy the world. They would destroy the Jewish world and the general world. There are many incidents with the Chafetz Chaim that are that help characterize him for us. There once was a man that came up to the Chafetz Chaim and he said, Rebbe, you know, you've got some dirt on your coat. Let me help you clean it off. And when he finished cleaning it off, so the Chafetz, and he was a poor man, so the Chafetz Chaim reached in his pocket to give him a tip, so to speak, to thank him for doing it, and then he realized that the man had picked his pocket, and that this was a diversion. So the Chafetz Chaim said, I'll meichel him the money. He said he must really, you know, if he has to pick the Chafetz Chaim's pocket, he must really be in a desperate situation. So I forgive him for it. Many of them, even a stronger story, that a man came up to him once and wanted to buy his sefer. So he said to him, here's 5 rubles. So the Chafetz Chaim said, all right. And the Chafetz Chaim took out his wallet, and then he had money that had been collected from the yeshiva. They had about 400 rubles in the wallet, and the guy grabbed the wallet and ran. So they wanted to pursue him. People wanted, the Chafetz Chaim said, don't. He said, he probably has a daughter that he has to marry off, or he's under tremendous financial pressure in order to do that. He said somebody just wouldn't come and steal 400 rubles from the Chafetz Chaim just like that. So he must be under tremendous pressure. So let him have it. And that's why he was famous for this type of behavior. He once drove by a farm, and they had a young boy pitching manure, fertilizer, with a pitchfork. And the guy didn't know how to do it. He was a young Jewish boy, probably the first time they put him out there. Chafetz Chaim stopped the wagon, got out, and showed him how to do it. Proper way to pitch manure. Well, I knew a Jew in Chicago. My father should live well. He was a guest in our house. His name was Mem Tzadik Hey Zakheim was his name. He was a Yiddish writer, and a very, very clever man. I knew him, he was in his 80s already. But he had studied in the Kelo that the Chafetz Chaim ran. This is one of the earliest Prussians that came by the Chafetz Chaim. So he described, I remember I was a small boy, he described that apparently he had missed the Seder he wasn't keeping the hours that he was supposed to keep. So the Chafetz Chaim called him in. So he said, the Chafetz Chaim he didn't know how to tell you that you weren't doing the right thing. So I remember he said he turned around and he made off like he was looking through his bookcase, and he said, people's fathers-in-law, they think that their sons-in-law are learning all the time. He said, if one doesn't learn all the time, then one fools the father-in-law. That's not nice to do. And that was his way of telling him, that you got to be here for the minyan on time, or that you have to be there to study on time. And that was the type of personality that's involved. The next lecture, God willing, will complete not complete the life, but will complete what we're going to talk about, and that'll take us from the beginning of the First World War until his death in the 1930s. This concluding lecture on the life of the chafetz chaim is dedicated in the memory of Golda Rivka Bat